background. So let me welcome everyone. This actually is, so this is a session of the virtual IO seminar, or VIOS, but it's coinciding with what would have been the CEPR Applied IO conference in Rome, which of course was canceled due to the coronavirus pandemic. I am Gregory Crawford. I wanted to say two things about that conference before we get into the panel. And my first is that I really want to give my sincere thanks to the scientific and local organizers of the conference, because they did tons of work, and then the coronavirus just wiped it all out. So this is Andrea Pozzi, Mar Regwant, and Nico Schutz. Andrea especially, because he was both on the scientific committee and the key local organizer. But the other thing I wanted to flag for the audience is that the other event that we saved from this conference was presentations by young researchers. So this is something we've been doing in the conference for a number of years recently. And so what we've done is, because, and you know, this is actually often an important chance for young researchers to get exposure. So what we've done is there's 7 researchers that would have presented at the conference, and we've gone ahead and created a web page and asked them to record 8-minute versions of short presentations of their papers. And so here you can see who they are, and they have links to their slides and their papers and whatnot. So I encourage everyone to have a look at that if they have a chance. Okay, otherwise I will kick off the panel. So let me say it's my very great pleasure to be the moderator, and that it's really one of the most interesting times to study IO in my career. Core IO topics are in the public eye, especially around dominant platforms. So you can't go more than a couple of months without the cover of The Economist being something about an IO topic, especially platforms. And the reason platforms are of concern is because, of course, there's concerns for those that don't follow the policy space here very closely. There's, you know, concerns that platforms aren't functioning as well as we might like. And so this, as a result, there have been a host of digital platform reports to look into market competition issues in platform markets, starting with Australia, and then the UK, then the European Commission, then the Stigler Center in the US, the University of Chicago. And there have since been others as well from Germany and France and so on. And so this is all in the last 18 months, but what's happening more recently is these reports, you know, and of course had recommendations, and these recommendations are finally turning into tangible policy actions. So both in Australia and the UK, there's talk of funding. In Australia, they have agreed to fund the digital platform units. The European Commission just here in the last month has talked about regulations for gatekeeper platforms, as well as talk of a new competition tool, perhaps modeled on the UK market investigations, and not directly tied to the Stigler Center report, but in the US, the state AGs have launched investigations into both Google and Facebook just in the last couple of months. And so the purpose of this panel is really to try to connect this policymaking to academic research. And the problem is that there's big gaps in knowledge. To design these effective policy proposals requires understanding well these markets, and each one is different. And so, to borrow a quote from one of our panelists, and you'll probably be able to guess who, if we seek to understand unprecedented phenomena, we can't just look at precedent. And so my goal today for the panel is that to have, and so these panelists who I'll introduce shortly are right at the cutting edge of policymaking in this area, to survey some of the things that they see that regulators are really working on and thinking about, highlight these gaps, and to make the session a call to arms. Again, a video, an image from the same panelist, which will definitely give away, and to try to connect academics to the policy questions. But even more, you know, I think there's this old quote that the mills of legislators and regulators may grind slowly, but they may grind extremely fine. And so our hope, my hope, is that we'd like to see some of these platforms engage on some of these topics, and so we'll talk about that a little bit in terms of questions and their feasibility. Okay, so let me introduce the panelists. So our panelists, let me start with Christina Cafara. So Christina is the Vice President and Head of European Competition Practice at CRA in London and Brussels, and has deep and broad experience in cases for across all these platforms. And we have Joshua Gans, who's a Professor of Management at the University of Toronto and a longtime commentator on tech industry. We have Fiona Scott Morton, who's a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice and committee chair of the Stigler Report on Market Structure and Competition, and Antitrust rather, and professor of economics at Yale. And then of course, Tommaso Valetti, former chief economist at DG Comp, and now professor of economics at Imperial College London. So we all agreed that it's very important to disclose. So I am happy to disclose I'm not working for or against any of the firms we're likely to discuss today. And I would just ask the panelists when they, briefly before they make some of their comments, that they make their own. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? We're not going to be limited to this at all. These were some of the, in the original announcement, there's more details about some of the topics that we have in mind, but we're not going to feel tied to this. So first we'll start with business models and this idea that often when people initially talk about treating digital platforms, there's a tendency to lump everyone together. And is that right? You know, different platforms have different business models, and the incentives for anti-competitive conduct may be different. And so I will pass it to Christina to kick this off, and then we'll just have an open conversation. A little bit about logistics. In principle, we'll talk about a number of topics, and we'll try to make regular breaks for questions from the panelists, from the audience. So you should feel free to use the Q&A button to type your questions. When we have a chance for questions, we will try to turn on your video and audio and let you ask the question yourself to make it a little more dynamic. If you prefer not to ask it, of course, you can just indicate that in the chat and we will ask your question on your behalf. Okay, Christina,
okay.
Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll start, of course, with disclosure, which is a must. My disclosure list is very long, so I'll try and say it fast. I worked adverse to Google in a number of matters. I've worked never for or against Facebook. I've done work for Amazon. I've done work for Apple. I've done work for Uber. I've done work for Microsoft. I've done work for Netflix and perhaps a few more than I'm forgetting. I'm assisting the Attorney General in the US on the Google probe. So a long list. I hope you listen to me anyway, because I hope that this exposure to these type of work, I think, helps to gain insight into what is real and what are the business problems that are being addressed, but also because anyone who knows me knows that I will never ever say anything that I don't think, or no one will ever make me say anything that I don't think. So these are, of course, my views. I want to start with what Greg sketched briefly, which is, of course, there's been a succession of important developments in this space recently. The most recent one, which is one that really is a call to arm even more than before, is this certainly this package of measures that the European Commission is consulting on, issued only last week, about platform gatekeeper regulation. This is going to be a game changer, and it's coming down the pipes extremely fast. The talk is about either potentially a telecom-style broad horizontal type of regulation along the lines of line of business restrictions, or some sort of black and white list of conducts for all specific practices that are going to be found problematic. So we are in the stage where we need to design this regulation. This is super important, and both for the antitrust cases that are progressing and for the design of this regulation, it is essential that we're going to be able to rely on two things. One is good applied theory that is germane, and it is pointed to the questions that we are now considering. And I'll talk a bit more about that. But also, we need to do more empirical research. And we, of course, know that the main obstacle in this space to doing good, high-quality research is the lack of data. And one of the things that we all also know is that this comes down to these actors being historically very unwilling to share data for academic empirical research. This is clearly a big gap. Which I think is going to be needing to be somehow fixed, because these companies can go into regulators and bring along their consultant and say, here, I've got this little piece of evidence that convinces you, but it is not until this work is being done independently, in the sunlight, without strings attached, that anyone will be convinced about the kind of propositions that are being put forward. So one of the pieces of work that is being done, even for those who work with some of these players is really convince them that there is a benefit to society and to them as well, if they've nothing to hide, to come out and provide independent data for independent, researchers to be able to do empirical work. Let me go back to what I want to mostly talk about, and it's really this business model idea, and it is an invitation really to all on in this field to really do more specifically in terms of the kind of problems, the kind of question we are being faced, needing to develop applied theory that speaks to that. Of course, we know that theory is super important when we have these cases. If you think about the Google cases, much of the skepticism that you find in the US, for example, amongst economists about the Google search cases, because there is a perception that that was somewhat whimsical, there was not real theory behind it. What does the self-preferencing really mean? It's not really kind of a thing. Different in the case of Android, but in fact there was good theory behind it. There was good theoretical work that supported this idea, that explained how the one monopoly profit kind of paradigm could be broken when you have a price constraint on one side, and extracting the surplus was something that could be done more effectively through the time practice there. So that kind of has a different weight in the end, even in the public discourse. So what are the issues that are super topical right now, and that really, for which we need these models? We need the extensions to the literature. And I'm aware, and I talk about it, that there is, of course, incipient work there. There is work that is beginning to emerge, but it is something that needs to be done at a greater pace, and more people need to focus on it. So clearly the question now, how is the owner of a platform going to deal with businesses that operate on the platform and effectively create value together? How is it going to extract that value? How is it going to set the access fees? How will it conduct itself when it sees the opportunity to launch its own services in competition with those of the third parties? Will it squeeze? Will it marginalize? Will it raise their cost? And of course, there is the whole data dimension. How will it use the data which are being jointly generated through activities on the platform, perhaps to undermine the third party's innovation by using their data? All of this is in part what has come under the umbrella of the umpire and player discussion. The term umpire is not always familiar to people, but effectively describes a situation in which you are playing in a field and at the same time setting the rule. So these questions, these very questions, are super live now. There is an investigation of Amazon which is underway. There will be developments in the coming weeks, I expect. There will be similar developments in the Apple space. So of course, these are not entirely new questions, because we had this kind of player and rule maker kind of dynamics in other industries. We had them in telecoms, we had them in broadcasting, but the differences are material in terms of the type of fundamental characteristics. Remember, in telecoms, telcos pretty much operate a single business model. This isn't the case here. And of course, when I talk about having to model behavior of platforms, of course, I'm talking to a bunch of economists. We are all clear that there is literature that goes back some time that talks about how different tools that one can use to extract surplus from a platform, what can be different ways of having access fees to the platform. And we have all of the standard traditional literature from Rocher-Tirole, from Armstrong, and so on. We've also got more recent literature that looks at behavior with price constraint on one side. We have Cho and Jeon, we have Julien and Amelio. So we have some of that, but it is yet not focusing entirely on the right question. There are a few, Huggy and Wright, perhaps Cornier and Taylor, who do kind of things in this space, and this is beginning to emerge. But we are in a place where people who actually deal with tech all the time and discuss tech all the time, like Ben Thompson, you may not have heard of him. He's a tech blogger, very popular amongst the tech industry. His constant refrain is that somehow we are getting it all wrong, because the economics of the different platforms is so different that by lumping them together and trying to think of them as behaving in similar ways, self-preferencing in similar ways, raising rival costs, we are not really understanding the dynamic, and we are really failing to do the job properly, or thinking about regulation. So my key point here, and I'll be brief, is that I think more thinking needs to go into how platforms monetize differently. There is a big heterogeneity in business models across them. You have ecosystems that monetize on the consumer side by selling a product, a device, others that are funded through some sort of license fee, a subscription, like Microsoft. There are others that are transaction platforms that monetize through a commission on a particular sale when they match buyer and seller. And there are, of course, the ad-funded platforms that provide free services, and they monetize, of course, through targeted advertising. And the differences here is important because the way in which each of these platforms will react to the evolution of the ecosystem, to strategies for interacting with the third parties on their platform, to complement us on the platform, will be different in different models, because the way in which the surplus can be extracted will vary with the different models, and in particular, the welfare effects of the various choices they make will vary in different models. In a nutshell, if you have platforms that somehow set a form of pricing on the consumer side, they of course extract part of the surplus that way, and their way of thinking about all of the key decisions on commissions, on quality levels, on entry decision will be different, because they can extract part of the value in a particular way from a platform that doesn't do that, and effectively has to rely on an ad-funded type of model. So I want to just give a shout to Federico Etro. He's done some work in this space, and he has got some interesting models looking both a situation where you have monetization of, which is done through a device, model, and in competition with an ecosystem that doesn't monetize in this way. That's interesting, some interesting results there. He's done some work to look at how an e-commerce player like Amazon is actually going to make choices when you consider that it does monetize in terms of commission on third parties, in terms of its own retail activity. And then there is the whole dynamic piece, which I'm not going to go into. But of course, in thinking about competition, we need to think about how these choices are also taking into account of the dynamic of the competition between the platform. If you are, again, an e-commerce player like Amazon, you obviously think about, I want to keep these consumers for the long term. I don't want him to glance away and go somewhere else. So this, again, of course, determines how I fix my commission, how I think about how I behave to third parties. So I won't take it any longer because you get my drift, but essentially I think that this is an area in which I see incipient work, which policymakers and agencies and people in this space are starved of. This requires more and fast. And I think if we can do it in a way that is sufficiently timely, it will have an important impact on the way in which we regulate, which is inevitable and is coming, and it is a game changer. So let me stop there.
Okay. And so Joshua, Tommaso, or Fiona, does one of you want to pick up on this?
Fiona. Sorry.
I would say one thing, and apologies if my internet connection makes me inaudible, but a really basic comparative static that I would love to see more of is, let's take a platform. Imagine that that is the environment. How does competition manifest itself on the platform? If you set the rules, what do you want those rules to be to maximize social welfare? And then compare that to maximizing profit. And then back up one stage and say, now imagine that platform is competing with other platforms. And it's a proprietary platform. Now, again, what does the social planner do? what do the profit maximizing owners of those platforms do? I think that 2x2 is something that would generate tremendous clarity for regulators and help us understand whether we're talking about something that we should characterize as necessary, essential facility kind of language, or whether we're talking about something where competition between the platforms is going to discipline the firm into providing something that the consumer.
Let me pick up on what Fiona was saying regarding sort of where we need the gaps in research. We've known since we started 20 years ago, seriously looking at platforms, that it is very hard to draw the same types of general conclusions that we were more confident of doing with respect to the traditional view of product markets. And I think this happened time and time again. It happened with credit cards that I was involved in. It happened in advertising markets that Simon Anderson and his raft of co-authors have been looking at quite early. And it's, you know, in the recent literature, looking at some of the specific contracts or impacts of vertical integration or other things like that, it's happening again. I would dearly love to have Fiona's 2x2. But I have to say, after 20 years, I don't think there is a 2x2. I think that in many respects, it is a situation that is akin to the problems we face in market design in general, where the specifics of the situation, some of the technological constraints and some of the choices of who is making these decisions all come together and need to be pulled apart for that situation, at least in order to be able to do an enforcement action. You know, it is very, very tempting, for instance, to look at the reach of Google or Facebook or Apple or even Amazon, although its reach isn't quite the same, and then say to yourself, well, these are somewhat systemically important in the overall market for attention. And you start to draw the market as big as the economy itself. And we know where that ends up. That ends up just too complicated to be able to tease out what, say, an adjustment in the rule for how you run an advertising auction, or even a, you know, potential entry of a startup with a particular sliver of the technology stack will impact. And so historically, you know, with regard to competition enforcement, we've shied away from that. And we've tried to understand that the behavior that we're concerned about and its consequences within its own domain, within the domain of the decision makers making those actions, in the domain of the first order effects that are going on. What is the impact on the closest market, the closest set of customers? And so that's why I'm skeptical about whether we can get generalized things. That said, because we're trying to have fun here, let me try one principle that helps me when I approach these things. And it's both simplistic, yet we don't do it often enough. When I'm analyzing a particular set of behaviors or set of actions, and I want to ask myself, is this set of actions causing good products to be driven from the market and substituted with bad products, with all the value-laden terminology for good versus bad? You know, just before we entered this, clicked live here, the panelists were lamenting some of the failings of Zoom in our present environment. And, you know, why haven't we improved certain things about it? Now, that's a whole broader analysis. The very fact that we have Zoom at all is already an indicator that there's some products available. But what we'd be concerned about is if one of these had sort of network effects and there was just one Zoom operator and you wanted particular features, and no one could come in and innovate it without displacing the whole corpus of Zoom itself. Well, that's what I mean by a bad product keeping out the good. And it's not the good for everybody, it could be the good for a niche. So when it comes to any of these platforms, we can defy the same logic. Someone is coming in, would like to improve an offering for a set of customers on a certain dimension. If the reason that's not happening is because one of these platforms is so big that they have one size fits all rules, well, there we got a problem. There we've got a problem there. That's the sort of thing we're talking about here. If they could tweak those rules such that this product could come in and be able to test the market of which it is it better than what is existing there, then we can be more confident about this going on. And so I think the overall message that we get from concerns of platforms on a combination of network effects, switching costs, and vertical integration is that it changes the terms for what is a good product to you have to displace the platform as opposed to the elements of it. And given how big these platforms are and given all the roles that they play and the fingers in all the different pies, that's a tough standard. So I don't want to see a 2x2 that says, is there sufficient platform competition? Because I don't think that's definable at the scale that we're talking about now. Anyhow, so that's my general view.
Okay.
I may say a few words, Greg, may I?
Yeah, please, of course.
Very good. First, I don't have anything to disclose. I'm not doing any consultancy work for anyone. I want to say something slightly more general. I hope it is of some interest. So here we're talking about, we have a large audience of colleagues in front of us. They are researchers, and so some of these researchers may be doing research which is related to competition policy. So I'm speaking more directly to them. Of course, research can also be done for other purposes. There is pure research, and I totally respect that. But if you do research which is related to competition policy, and the digital platforms we're talking about are those which are subject to competition policy, you should know that it is a fun game, but also a very dirty game. There is just too much money at stake. There's a lot of money. So if you're in that sphere, it's difficult to remain neutral. What do I mean? So you can write your model and do your results, and then you may not care about the policy implication. That's fine. I'm not saying you should. But if you're interested in the policy implications of your research, you have to be aware that either you take stands or your results are likely to be manipulated, misquoted, redacted, taken out of context. So at least, again, you may want to do nothing against it, but just being aware is important. I will mention an anecdote. My anecdotes are always the best, which involves Greg. I mean, reluctantly, but it involves Greg. So it just occurred to me when I was at the commission that there is a whole bunch of people and institutions that you may not know academically because they don't know scholarship, but whose purpose is to be constantly next to the policymakers. So I'm happy to name people. So this is like the Global Antitrust Institute at the George Mason University. They don't do research, but they have people who's really the job, they're paid, and they don't disclose funding, by the way, they're paid but in order to be always asked by the Department of Justice, by the Federal Trade Commission to present evidence when there are hearings, when there are cases. What's turned to be very curious to me, because I had never heard of them before, is that they go there and they say that they portray the economic consensus, and in particular, the economic consensus in the field of industrial organization. Okay? That's what they say. Now, we have a crowd of IO people here, and you don't even know that. You don't even know what is the submission of the Global Antitrust Institute in front of the hearing of the FTC. But just because at that moment I was at the commission, I just happened to have a look. And they had in particular a submission about vertical mergers. And they concluded by, again, redacting, quoting, misquoting a selected number of papers from the literature, that the literature overwhelmingly confirmed that consumers benefit from vertical integration. And that was the statement. And then I went to see the details, and they were quoting the econometric paper of Greg and et al. And they were saying, for instance, this is a paper that again confirms that there is this presumption that we can take with us. And I had to involve, and I said, no, guys, I mean, you don't know the last 20 years of the economic of IO literature. There is a trade-off. Of course, there is elimination of double marginalization, but there's also the potential for foreclosure. So there is no result, and we have to assess empirically what you mean in a certain case. He said, no, this is the literature. I had to ask Greg, and he was not even aware that his research was being misquoted, and they stopped arguing only when Greg himself said, guys, this is not what my paper, my paper finds this under this condition and these other things. So there is no presumption. It's a case-by-case assessment. That's what I can conclude. So you need to be aware of this and perhaps become a little bit more assertive. Again, if you're interested in a policy, you have to come up, once you've done a paper or a streams of paper of 10 years of research or 20 years of research on a certain topic, you have to ask yourself, where do I stand? This is my personal position as well. Otherwise, well, you may say, I don't know. That's the honest answer. But if you do know something, and again, decisions are taken in limited time with lots of asymmetric information, but have to be taken. And so after all our studies, where do we stand on a certain topic? I think it's important. And as a profession, perhaps, we should come up with some priors on some particular questions, because otherwise we don't go very far. The application of this general concept, for instance, is just an example. Those of you which are currently doing works on, say, concentration or margins or common ownership, you have to distinguish the analysis when we are looking at the general economy, at market trends, which are very informative, of course, as opposed to the cases that enforcers are dealing with. The cases enforcers are dealing with are related to selected few. So perhaps there is no need to come up with generalization which apply across the board, because it's impossible to do that, but we might have a view of what increases in concentration mean for extremely concentrated markets to start with. So we don't need to know whether self-preferencing is a good or a bad thing for any firm, but we need to know whether self-preferencing is good or bad for very, very large firms. And there is a distinction there that we need to draw. Otherwise, by pooling all of this together, we are just making the message murkier. Third point I want to make is that as academics, we need to do a little bit of soul searching. So we are in a certain situation now also because we have embarked on a direction of our field which has become too extreme in my personal view. So the structural IO stuff that we've been doing for the past 20 years have become far too extreme. And again, I start from the very beginning. Ask yourself why you're doing that. If you're doing that because it's an interesting research question as such, and you may come up with an answer 5 years from now, that's great. I'm not going to limit anybody's intention to work on that. If you think you want to do that because you want to have an impact on policy and on cases and give a helpful tool, you're fooling yourself. Okay? You're fooling yourself because these things are not used. They're not used because of lack of time, lack of resources, lack of data, and yet cases have to be decided on the basis of something. And if not us, as IO people, have nothing to say, who? Then we leave it to the lawyers, which is fine, which is another approach. But I think this is saying something about our profession, that we failed to have an impact on what we thought would naturally belong to the sphere of industrial organization. So, and here, especially the more senior of us, which have position in editorial journals, because people respond to incentives. If you're a junior guy, you're going to do what you think is going to be published. But this is fine for the career of an individual, but it's not fine for society. So that's a bigger problem here. But I think IO has become extremely insular and extremely parochial when it comes, again, that's where I started from, to competition policy and the cases we're talking about. Maybe other branches in IO, which is great. So I don't want to make a super big claim, but when it comes to my more narrow field, that's where we are. Two concluding thoughts. One is when I left the commission, I asked my colleagues, amazing economists. They really are fantastic people, and I miss them every day. What they thought would be gaps in the literature that would be helpful to them as enforcers. I have a list of topics, if you're interested, I can go through later on. But I remember one quote that I want to leave you. Somebody saying, academic economists should propose frameworks, okay? To say it's a case by case, and I will apply the right papers, the right the right theories to each case is not a useful framework for us enforcers. It's ultimately, and now I quote, just as hopeless as the politicians, I will tell you what's bad when I see it, okay? So you have to perhaps think about this quote, which is, it's important. I will end on a note of hope, I hope. When we're talking about digital platforms, we're not going to go very far without data from those platforms. So it's fantastic if you are doing research in a small, cute digital platforms gave you access to a data set and you're going to do something and perhaps publish a good paper. But this is not going to inform me very much about the big question on Amazon, Facebook, Google, or whatever. So we need data from Amazon, Google, Facebook, and so forth. They're not going to release data. They never did, which is also another problem in terms of careers of people that go and join those companies, especially from the IO field. I hope some of the representatives of those companies are listening right now, because I think we can engage in a useful conversation with them. Some of these questions are very much first order, and as a professor, we have a lot to say. We have the right tools, we have the right attitude, and I think we could help. The alternative is that they stay close, as they always did, and they leave it to a more bureaucratic, legalistic approach. But this would be a pity, in my opinion, since this is a paradox. So they are sitting on the biggest trove of data ever. Some of the debates we could have could be so much informed by independent academic analysis, and we will learn a lot. As Christina, Joshua, Greg said earlier, there are different business models, and by learning about that, they should see the interest as well of having not just somebody rubber stamping from the Global Antitrust Institute writing a little paper that we already know what they're going to say, but to have independent scrutiny for researchers would be very important for them as well. I hope somebody's listening.
They are.
Christina, do you want to pick up on that?
Well, I mean, I on the last point, I of course mentioned it at the beginning, and I absolutely endorse the view that if people have something, if these companies have nothing to hide, and this is my pitch all the time, if really you are misunderstood, then it's only by opening up and providing data that can be used in the way that Tommaso says, that creates credibility and can move the dialogue forward. I think this message may, perhaps with the wind behind, slowly beginning to seep through, who knows, but it is the right message. Unless there is engagement on that, on the part of these companies, in the way that Tommaso described, I think just having consultants going into an agency with a little bit of evidence here and there is not going to just move the dial. And I really very much also agree with Tommaso about the importance of, and this was really my pitch, of engaging with the questions in the policy arena. Because it is true that, I'm not suggesting that people should be doing little models for specific cases, but the point is that without the kind of 2x2, if that may seem too specific, I think that's probably not right in my view. We need that kind of comparative statics. We need to understand how things compare, because that is what ultimately is going to inform people sitting down and writing regulation tomorrow, and it is going to matter. So I think that's really the thing.
Let me interrupt here. There's a few questions on a theme coming from the audience, so I'll ask both because they're related. So, from Philip Hansbach, what are to anyone who wants to take it, what are effective strategies or contexts for academic researchers to get platform companies to share data for research? And from Reinhilde Vogelers, I'm sorry, Reinhilde, if I massacre the pronunciation, and I'll add, can competition policy authorities provide easier access to their data to the academic community for research and ex post evaluation of their decisions?
Well, competition authority aren't going to give access to anybody unless firms allow for it, right?
Exactly,
so the bottleneck is going to be firms. Always.
It always seems attractive, I think, to academics to ask for the data from the competition authority, but the reason that they can get it in the first place is because they promise to keep it confidential, and that reputation is extremely important to the agency. So it's not really, you should not imagine that you can get data that way. The answer to the first question, I think, is that is really hard. And the way you want to do it is involve your general counsel's office so that you have the right to do any research in the domain that's specified without censorship or editing. But that probably you want to get together with other people and try to have a sustained push to get some kind of data set that's large and can be used for multiple questions, because it's a significant fixed cost to extract data from a large company like this.
Can we talk, the issue here is really about the relationship between academic research and having policy action. And I would never question Tommaso, who's been in the thick of it so much. Where I come to this is far more from the litigation side and being an expert witness, and I forgot to disclose that I'm acting on behalf of regulators in a couple of jurisdictions. And really it's the case that I do think, so applied theory research in particular, to me is very clarifying. When people have an insight, identify an effect, etc., that provides a guidepost of where to look for evidence. It's never going to be of the sort that we're looking for that is going to lend itself for academic publication, which is one of the tensions we get. Because when you're deciding on a policy action, you're not just looking at raw data. You're looking at a whole lot of things that, unless you've got to play with this, you don't get to see, which is, literally notes, PowerPoints, emails, and other things about actual decision points in companies. And once you've got a framework that comes from applied theory that you're looking for an effect, such as, there are some key elasticities of the way in which, Tommaso, you did it yourself with this work with Andrea about the allocation of attention as a way of thinking about the impact of that in competition. Those can be very important in sort of building up the framework of a case. And so that is very, very critical. What we can also get is, on the other side of that, having found that somebody is violating competition policy, the issue then afterwards is, then what? What do we do about it? Now, the tempting thing to do is to sort of work out some corpus of consumer harm and then impose a penalty. I would have to be skeptical about penalties, because we've got these big number penalties, but they seem not to matter in the scheme of things in terms of the value of the company. Or, let's send a message to shareholders that, look what happens when your people deviate. You're going to have $5 billion wiped off the value of your company if you can find it. And so, I think that's not what we're really on about. We want to find remedies that are actually going to have an effect. And some of the ones were posited here when Greg was sort of talking about how the regulators are approaching this around the world, are things designed to pry open the sort of hidden box of these things. When I talked before that, some big platform can have a one-size-all-set rule that ends up taking out key markets. The issue with that is not that there is a one-size-fits-all rule. People do that. We're all in friggin' universities. Basically, our lives are dealing with the consequences of one-size-fits-all rules. We know that that's an issue. But what we do, our reaction to that, backed up by the fact that we're difficult to get rid of, is to be annoying, complain, and eventually do something about it. With regard to these big platforms, there's no similar mechanism. There is no mechanism for voice, and no platform. You know, like Facebook have said, "Oh, we're having this committee, this and that." Right? Yeah, no one. Does anyone jump up and down about it? No, no one does, because it's within Facebook and they're the umpire. They set the rules. But if somebody comes in and imposes that on an industry, imposes that means of getting communication, getting investigation, triggering these things, and reducing the friction, so that if someone flies better rule is wiping out an important market because it is not profitable for the firm, but is actually socially valuable, we can have that come in and new rules can be developed. So one of the areas where I would like to see research is really to inform on what are the really effective remedies going on as we see these things get rolled out, to really analyze the effects. Because there, once you've established that there's a problem and a remedy is coming, that is where the weight of academic research can really play a role, because everybody's just, you know, pulling in things. It's unprecedented, so there's no precedent. So we want to
Josh,
look for the likely to work.
Fiona's keen to say. Fiona.
Go, Fiona.
so Josh, that's great. I 100% agree. But how do you apply a remedy if you don't have the model of the conduct to begin with? I mean, you have to start with what you think is happening, and then you can understand where this welfare losses are, and then you can understand what the remedy needs to be. So I do think we need the horse before the cart.
No, but
Having said that, at least in the United States, the field of regulation in economics has really died off. Either the people themselves have died, or the interest by the students has died, and it's become niche in environmental and maybe telecom. I think this is going to change. It has to change, because these remedies are not primarily, I think, going to show up as antitrust remedies. I think they're going to show up as regulation. And so we need a big push to understand regulation better in this space going forward. So I think if you're thinking about where to write a paper, that would be a good place.
Yeah, and I very much think that, Josh, remedies is a big lump of a problem in its own right, okay? Because there is limited experience in practice, again, with these remedies. In Europe, we have seen the European Commission, for reasons that are inherent limitations of the framework, but, and I quote Tommaso here, back to him, also perhaps to do with regulatory insecurity and some sort of timidity when dealing with these giants, not being sufficiently proactive and prescriptive in terms of the remedies that are being put forward. So we ended up with these situations in which, you know, you kind of try and push them in the direction of doing something that may look like a bit of margin squeeze, may look like a bit of an auction. In reality, it's an abject failure, and you have a run around for 2 years of the market test, and the parties and the complainants saying this doesn't work, and then the Commission in the end has to draw a nice veil and say Panglossian, everything is okay, we are in the best of all possible worlds. So remedies is a big theme in which we have limited practical experience. I was on an OECD discussion just 2 days ago in which, you know, you hear a lot about line of business restrictions a la telco. And I find that inapt, because it isn't what we, I think, need to necessarily do here, given the kind of heterogeneity in play. But it is, I think, as Fiona says, a problem that comes also at the end of having understood what the theory of harm is. And I think that the clarity on that has got to be the first point. And this is where I think there is a gap, and where policymakers, designers of regulation are not going to be able to yet rely on the breadth of literature that they would need. And that's, I think, where I still am.
I think Fiona's, talks about need for regulatory economics, and that's absolutely correct. I think there is a reluctance, and this is part of academic stuff as well. If it's not in the US, maybe some of the more, culturally significant European countries, it's not worth studying and it doesn't get into an academic journal. And I remember this 20 years ago, there was work being done on credit cards and people said, that's uninteresting. The only place that's pursuing credit card regulation is Australia. Therefore, why would you do this? And of course, now that we know, well, because credit card regulation was coming everywhere else, and therefore the places where it had been tried first are actually useful information for all that. And I see the same things with platforms. You know, occasionally you've got all these different countries that do rules that, you know, frankly, sometimes seem a bit crazy, but they happen. And they shake up a platform or a thing or whatever in different markets. We saw this all the time with broadcasting. You know, part of all of the information we have about broadcasting and television and radio comes from some country somewhere doing something and shocking their system. And that doesn't necessarily tell us it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it tells us what is effective and what isn't, and where the effects are. And you know, what did this? You know, when public TV was allowed to advertise in Germany, what effect did it have on advertising rates? Kind of useful. You know, it seems like a small thing, but it really tells us a lot about a whole market. And so that's where I feel that those things are informative. I'm not saying that you can craft good remedies without a theory of harm. Obviously you cannot. But there will be parameters that get slotted into that theory, which will not be as part of the embedded structural model of that particular case itself, but will be part of the effects. And people will be arguing over, is this an effect or is this not? And then those can be very useful, those studies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Greg, I wanted to just to respond, a slightly different topic,
Please.
but there were a couple of questions in the Q&A from Nikita. So she's asking what I think about the practical use of BLP in merger analysis. So it's irrelevant what I think about BLP, but it's more relevant to have a reality check whether it is being used by the agencies or not. Okay, that's the more relevant questions. And I don't know jurisdiction outside Europe, so I don't know the US in particular, but BLP during my 3 years of tenure was never used in any merger analysis by the European Commission. So, so people should think about it, okay? Whether we are doing it for the sake of doing it for academic careers, that's fine. But then that's not the story we would like to tell ourselves, that we're doing this to have policy impact. So again, the US may be different, but I don't think it would be much different. So in terms of empirical methods, which I saw applied, is at best, there would be calibrated merger simulation. That's what you do. And you calibrate it with some result from surveys on diversion ratios and so forth. That's what. But even our merger simulations that we have developed in the theory, in an actual case, would be, of course, affected by having to bring in the reality. So you start bringing in quality, investment, and things, which is something we cannot master from a theoretical point of view. So what you will have is the consultants that they bang the model here, they bang the model there. It becomes extremely dirty. And again, there is limited time, limited resources, and the debate becomes very obscure and completely unintelligible to the decision maker in the end. So that's where we have cornered ourselves right now with those methods or variants of those methods. They have a question of, so ultimately, I do have a negative view about the impact that BLP had on the policy, and I have to say that, and I'm not making myself very popular, but that's what I feel. The other point that Nikita asked, when you are misquoted, what do you do against it? That's a very fair question, but a very difficult one to answer, because the game, the field is so unleveled. You have institutions whose job is to do what I just said, and then it's up to individuals because of their own personal ethos. But again, yes, I will try to fight those guys as much as I can, but I have a job, I have a family, that's not what I'm paid for. So it's out of my personal goodwill. So the only thing we can do is basically to raise awareness, and that's what we're doing right now. And so by mentioning it, by making it a little bit more transparent, perhaps we can have a little impact. That's all I can say.
Can I follow up on that, Tommaso? I think it's even worse, because if your views are being represented inside an agency proceeding, you would have no way to know that that was happening. So that's one thing. Another thing is to be very careful about how you write the conclusions of your paper. Just think about how the rent seeker is going to use the results in your paper, and make sure in your conclusion there are sentences that represent your views accurately. So that if someone tries to pick off a result from version 3, the decision maker can read the conclusion of your paper and see what you really think. Even if in some particular setting or in one version of a simulation, you get a particular answer, but overall you get a different kind of answer. Just make sure your conclusion says exactly what you mean and doesn't leave wiggle room for someone who's trying to misinterpret to succeed. And you can probably guess how the misinterpretation would go, because it would be the rent-seeking party that would be wanting to do that.
Let me just briefly add, because having written a paper that has been used in policy work, just to reemphasize what Fiona just said, and really to encourage authors. I know there's very little academic return to writing short policy summaries of your paper, but there's a huge policy return to writing short policy summaries of your papers. And there's lots of outlets now. There's Vox.eu, there's Micro Insights. You can just post it on your website. And then you really control the message in a way that's very important, not only for you, but for policymakers.
Yeah. Okay. So
let's actually segue a little bit to umpire and player. So we've touched on it a little bit at times. Joshua's talked about one rule fits all. How should we think about this issue of a platform being both so for those in the audience that aren't, that basically is setting the rules for other players and then competing with them themselves. Who wants to kick it off?
Well, I think nobody thinks that's a good idea. If we thought that was a good idea, we would design sports that way. And some go very far. Like in cricket, you can't even you have to get a neutral country to be the umpire in cricket matches these days, just because of that entire thing. But I see from Patrick Ray's question is also sort of about umpire over what? Umpire over what? There's umpire over rules, and there's sort of the consequences of them. As Patrick mentioned, in the olden days, we were worried about people who are vertically integrated and therefore were cooperating, competing on both sides, setting rules that could look like something that was favored for one business, but end up having the consequent flow-on effect of raising rivals' costs. Similarly, we see the same sort of thing with regard to innovation these days. In fact, I think that's the primary thing. The price levers are actually far more muted in platforms because that's how we've set them up. We've set them up as sort of big steering functions where we're trying to steer business one way or the other and trying to build moats around these things. Well, I mean, we, as in if I were Google or Facebook or something like that. And so they have various rules along those lines. But the true threat of competition comes from innovations that start to chip away important parts of the business. The one-size-fits-all rule is vulnerable where people can cream skim. And cream skimming is the way in which we get innovation into these markets. So one-size-fits-all rule can shut down places where there's opportunity to create more value for smaller players that end up, if they are worked out, they might be good for that part, which is something socially valuable, but they also might be a bridge to being able to do much, much more. And we saw this because half of the companies we're talking about today started off small and started off in those niches and then came big. And if they had been stamped out, we wouldn't see them. And so really that measure of innovation and innovativeness, and we can see what happens to those changes. We can see when a platform rule causes fewer experiments being done in innovation. We can point to those instances. They're never going to be the large numbers that we want to get statistical significance, but they're going to be powerful in of themselves because you can actually see what's going on.
I think another place that's really important, Josh, is thinking about this in terms of complements versus substitutes. If you're on a platform, sort of by definition, you're a complement to that platform. You're an application on that platform, you're content, you're something that's drawing people to the platform that makes it better. And the issue becomes if you grow and then you develop a relationship perhaps with consumers or technology shifts in a certain way, then that complement can become a threat as a substitute. Then the umpire player becomes a problem because at that point, the owner of the platform says, I don't want more competition and substitutes. I'm just going to cut this party off or disable some functionality or change the rules or have technical interoperability problems, all of which, if it's a proprietary platform, is fairly straightforward to do. And so this is one of the main ways that we see declines in innovation and exclusionary conduct manifesting itself, I think. Sorry, Christina, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, let's just kind of remember where this expression umpire and player came from and how it has entered the discussion of platforms and policy. Of course, this comes from Senator Warren, who said at the time that there was no alternative solution to this problem of inherent conflict of incentive of a platform that simultaneously plays on itself in competition with others than breaking up. Okay, so there is a body of thought, and it is not just her, there is something which is quite diffuse that says there is an inevitable, inherent conflict of incentives that we cannot hope to solve in any other way than with separation. Now, this is really the origin of my sort of plea that we think a bit more finely about this, because of course we have these kind of integration issues in other industries. We've faced them for years. In broadcasting, we've come to the view that this is an empirical question. Whether someone has an incentive to foreclose is an empirical question in the circumstances. Greg's work and Tommaso's mentioned it. So what are the limiting principles for this umpire player narrative, which in the wild actually means let's break up? Isn't it different across platform? Isn't it different what we want to do depending on what the incentives are? Isn't it an empirical question of what the relative incentives to operate in a way that ends up in raising survival cost and self-preferencing? Doesn't self-preferencing look different across different platforms? So this is really where I think I come from when I say we need a bit more support in making these kind of judgments, because it isn't an inevitable sort of umpire player inevitably means that there is a very large foreclosure incentive. It depends. It will depend on the circumstance. And so to me, this is why more research that looks into this. And to answer Patrick's question, there is both a static dimension in which we study the behavior statically and we inform ourselves about relative outcomes if we look at these things in a different kind of business model. But of course, the dynamic dimension is super important. And there the questions are around if you're a platform that is actually interested in, for example, preserving your customers for the future because you want to maximize that future profit stream that comes from preserving them with you, how do you behave in competition with other platforms, for example? And of course, there is the whole data dimension that don't forget is going to be one of the main focuses of the Commission in its kind of actions going forward. How do we think about this data, which is actually effectively jointly generated, but can be used by the platform to just put itself in front of the party that's actually selling the product by innovating ahead of them or creating products that are. So these are the questions that are practical and relevant out there, dynamic questions.
Okay, so we have some good questions from the audience. So let me take Steve's first. So I won't read it because everyone can read it. But basically it's a question directed towards Fiona and Tommaso. about making post-merger data available after the fact. What can one do about this? I don't know if either one of you wants to do.
I think there's substantial agreement, excuse me, across the political spectrum in the US that we would like to have more merger retrospectives. I think to do that, we probably need Congress or some major shift to be instructing agencies that after some period of time, the data can be released to academic researchers, and furthermore that firms must supply data after a merger that is relevant to the questions of interest. And then that can be used by the agency immediately and possibly others later. I think this is a great idea. It's not implemented at the moment, but I think we could learn a lot if we did something like this.
I also think that where we can help is by, especially if there are editors listening to this, understanding that publishing papers on merger retrospectives are important. It's something which is very difficult to publish academically, and instead, I mean, there is some work which I want to commend from Tommaso Duso and others which are trying to do that, but they always have, or Oli Aschenfelter and others, they tried, but they always had a tough time in publishing it in top journals. And instead, these are first order questions because we have our priors about how mergers work, and then we don't know how they actually work. All the remedies, almost zero mergers are blocked in practice because at best we impose some remedies. We have no idea whether the remedies that were imposed by the authorities worked as they were planned or not. In terms of the agencies, I managed to sneak in one particular merger decision a couple of years ago when I was in Brussels in a merger involving Brazilian timber, so not the biggest case, but we managed to sneak in also a clause that they had to monitor some price data and give them back to do academic analysis. So I have to go back on the exact details of the case. But so it is possible to think in a creative way about these things. But since this is, again, a forum for academics, I want to say do that kind of research, but that kind of research, and I hope this is perceived as important because it is important. We should publish these papers in good journals, I think.
Mm. And I wanted to, oh, sorry, Christina,
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to take Mike Walker's question because I think this is a really good question about what authorities can do to stimulate the right academic research. I really don't think authorities communicate to the academic community the questions they'd like to have answered. And this would be hugely helpful.
I agree.
To be able to say, here's, we don't have any good estimates of this kind of elasticity or this kind of value of data, or could you tell us more, give us more results on behavioral biases about defaults. We need quantitative estimates of these categories of things. And they don't need to be requests that give away anything confidential about a case, but often if it's a problem that an authority is struggling with in one case, it's going to be appearing in other ones, and it's going to be appearing around the world. And particularly for junior people looking for something that's policy relevant, but also of interest to them, it would be just terrific if agencies had a list of outstanding things they wish they knew that they just updated every year. And told people, okay, there's enough of, item 1 on the list from last year. We've got enough of that now. Moving on, we've got 3 different things that are top priorities. I think that'd be wonderful.
Can I just say to that, I think one point Fiona makes is super important because the Commission, for example, has its incredibly high profile group of academic advisors, right? Greg is on it. I don't know who else. I mean, I'm sure that Patrick is on it. Everyone who is famous is on it. And then you can think that the Commission can communicate and does what is the useful research, but I think it would be much more productive to involve more junior people, more junior academics in that kind of activity. Because if you are going to ask the super busy, super famous academics to just give you some useful framework to think about coordinated effects, it ain't gonna happen. They haven't got the time and it is difficult. So give an interesting topic to some group of more junior researchers who actually feel the urgency to do something policy relevant. I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, I love that idea, especially for theory work, because I think as Joshua pointed out, sometimes theory work can really clarify what is a theory of harm, what, you know, and can enlighten the mechanisms underlying a particular competition problem. But I wanted to, I know it's not my panel, but follow up a little bit on what Tommaso said, is I also see a disconnect between what I think should be the openness of the top journals to policy work and what I see that it is. You know, I do structural work, and the top journals are very open to structural work, and so if you can combine structural work with policy work, great, then, you know, best of all worlds. But they seem far less open to non-structural policy work, and I would love to see more top journal editors engage, because these are really, as I said in my opening statement, these are the most fascinating times, and these are questions that competition authorities need answers to. And to help align the incentives of academics with these questions would be extraordinarily helpful, but I haven't seen it happening yet.
It's also, I find it quite despairing, in fact, that we are talking about the top 5 firms in the world by market capitalization, and whether it is business strategy or competition policy or something which is related to industrial organization, there is no work which is being done with from the you know, hardcore IO crowd. Of course, if you talk to other people in computer science, but these are different fields. But in the hardcore IO, we should be, again, the perimeter here is IO, and we never get grasp of what they're doing. So this is where
first, Tommaso, you know, we can't get to this until we've done concrete. Concrete markets have to be set. Once we've done that, we can move to the next one.
Yeah, we've done a lot of concrete. We have done a lot of, you know, ready-to-eat cereals and a few low-fat yogurts, but there is more.
1980s cable TV also need more of that.
Easy, Joshua, easy.
So to the audience of young and ambitious people, a couple of things that I would love to know, and these are, you know, just interesting. I don't know if academically or whatever, but it's so interesting. If you take the business model of Facebook and the business model of Google, it's advertising funded. Let's have some, you know, feeling of what's the order of magnitude here. They're making $250 billion a year in advertising, $250 billion per year. We have no clue about who's buying that advertises, where it is going. There has been, I mean, maybe it's a journalistic style, but a big document from, was it EY? I mean, some recently that even said that 20%, they try to trace a little bit following, and 20% of that money is lost. I mean, we need to address that question, just to have a mapping. Is it the big guys, the small guys, all of them, and how and why? Is online advertising actually working? We have no clue about conversion rates. We have a few documents which are put forward by Google itself, but why should I believe something which is obviously in their interest? So this is so interesting and so important that why are we not looking? Maybe some people are, maybe, and I apologize for the work which is already being done, but I looked hard into this question. I cannot even follow the simple transaction between this humongous amount of money and who's actually paying for it. So having an idea about it would be brilliant, and I'm sure you would be able to publish it well too.
Yeah. And it would be first order important to the measuring harms topic that in theory we were going to discuss.
Okay, I was going to say, did you want to move to harms, Greg?
Yeah, please. Go ahead, Fiona.
Okay, so sorry, I realize I haven't done my disclosures. I've done a lot of work for Apple, and I'm currently working for Amazon at the moment. So, and miscellaneous other people in the past. Harms. One of the things about harms that I find quite frustrating is that the defendants in these cases and the popular press and regular people who aren't IO economists kind of all glom together in the same confusion. Of course, regular people who aren't economists have the natural confusion, and the defendants want to work with that, which is that because the consumer is not paying anything, therefore somehow there's no problem here. And as Tommaso just mentioned, you don't get $250 billion of revenue out of a free product. So obviously somebody's paying. And that payment occurs in two forms. One is dollars or euros from the advertiser, and the other is data and attention from the consumer. So we can think about this as a barter transaction. And if I'm going to trade you 6 apples for 4 oranges, and the competitive rate is 6 oranges, and you're only paying me 4, we understand that that's as much of an overcharge as if we were denominating this transaction in some other unit. So I think for economists, this is not confusing. It's barter combined with a two-sided platform where money is the unit of payment on the advertiser side. But this is just, comes up again and again and again. I just released these 2 roadmaps of harm for Facebook and Google ad tech, and in both cases all the reporters ask this question. So that I find very frustrating. Probably in terms of welfare, of course, innovation and quality are going to be the 2 areas where we have the most at stake, and those are of course the places where our tools are least good. So it would be really wonderful if we could develop some more tools to handle issues like innovation and quality. I think, you know, and I'll close with saying the last place that I feel needs attention from us just in our public statements is pushing back on what is the but-for world. So another thing you hear about is, well, you know, there's a lot more digital advertising than there used to be. Output's gone up. And this, of course, is reminiscent of the court in American Express. There are a lot more credit card transactions than there used to be. Output's gone up. And you know, we're not really interested in comparing yesterday to today and saying, well, there's a trend in technology, therefore something good happened. We're interested in comparing today with competition versus today without competition. And would there be more or less output in that comparison? So making sure we construct a but-for world that, for example, has digital advertising and not horse and buggy, and compare that to a monopoly versus non-monopoly is extremely important. And I would encourage everyone to be very careful when they speak to be educating the population about that distinction.
But consumer harms is a topic that's going to be, and it is already, of enormous importance, because what we do in Europe, we worry, of course, when we have these enforcement cases about the first order effect, which is damage to the competitor. And then we sort of, you know, take the view that that must imply harm to consumers in some form. When you translate that to the field of litigation, which is coming up in these fields, then there is a much kind of closer focus on what is a judge going to make of that, because the other side is going to say, you need to show me concrete consumer harm. And how do we do it when we don't have yet, you know, we talk in general about effects on quality, for example, but how do we nail that down? You'll see that there is prosecution who is going to be quite reluctant to pursue harms around product quality because the position is, well, the judge won't buy it. There is no precedent.
Yeah. So Christina, I share that, and I really think that this is an area for reform in both jurisdictions, because it is not the case that the harms only occur in dimensions that we are good at quantification, where we are good at quantification. Exactly. Innovation is a harm, and if the court says, well, unless you can give me a number, 23.6, then I'm going to discount innovation harms, we have a big problem, because then we have measurement tools for some kinds of harms and we don't for others. But just because we don't know how to quantify them doesn't mean that they aren't really substantial and important. So this is a major place in which the use, unfortunately, the pushing forward of the field and being able to quantify some things is being seized on by defendants as a reason why they should win, because we cannot produce an equivalent tool for the harm in their particular case. That's very dangerous. Let me say 2 more things about harms, just specifically about consumer harms. One is, of course, the pass-through of higher advertising costs to higher prices, or less investment in the product because it's expensive to get customers. And these are often variable or marginal costs, so that's something we could quantify if we needed to. A second thing is something I'm working on now, which is the nature of the quality of the platform. It's not obvious to me. In fact, I should be more direct. There is a growing medical literature that says that using more social media and more of these digital platforms is harmful to consumers. So we should think about this as more like cigarettes without a regulator. And if you have cigarettes without a regulator and there's some conduct that increases output, then that's not going to increase consumer welfare necessarily. You're going to have to show me some pretty careful empirical work to demonstrate that that's increasing consumer welfare. And I think we are in a similar situation with some of these platforms, and that's going to be a place where, just increasing engagement doesn't mean that we have increased consumer welfare, the way we might say that more purchase of shoes means we've got more consumer welfare in shoes.
I don't know about that. I mean, if you've got too many shoes, every time you walk into your closet, you don't know what to wear. It's a whole dilemma. I don't.
The problem I face every day. Absolutely.
No, Chris. It's funny to me because I only have mine are all the same. I eliminated this, but nonetheless, the problem with I appreciate what Fiona's saying, and it gets back to the thing I was talking about, what's a good product, what's a bad product, and other things to it. I have to sort of think that there's a stay in your box, stay in your lane aspect to competition policy here. For instance, advertising. Advertising is annoying. I know in every single model of advertising where it's modeled as annoying, the welfare implications of competition become more and more ambiguous. I sort of feel that if a product may be a bad, and that would include cigarettes in it, competition policy isn't the tool to adjudicate that part of it. We can still say, not that I would do this, but we can still say in the case of cigarettes, or now we're talking about this with the case of cannabis and marijuana, which has its own set of regulations and limitations on competition coming in. Basically, all of that, you want to see an industry, all of that's been pushed towards these really large firms and driving out small firms. But if you say that, high prices are good, you sort of get away from that. But we don't really mean that, because we don't want to engage the high price mechanism for increasing supply in any of these cases. And that includes in social media or anything else like that. So I feel we have to stick to our knitting, and we have to have another instrument to deal with the consequences if those are judged to be bad, because it's just a slippery slope. That's all.
Yeah.
Let
me quickly clarify. I'm not thinking the antitrust case is the regulation. I'm just saying that our normal shortcut of more output of shoes is good for consumers is not a shortcut I'm willing to take in these markets that have goods with these characteristics.
There's a question of
please,
Jacques, of Jacques Cremer in the chat, asking when thinking about Google not knowing what happens to Google advertising money, whether there is a wider failure of the regulatory system, which has not forced Google to release data. Of course. If you think of other industries where you can do research on related issues, from telecommunications to airplanes to pharma, it's because there is some regulator out there, and data have to be provided, and they're made sometimes public, or there are even private firms collecting data in. The IMS is the data set for pharmaceutical research, and you pay for it. So Google has managed to navigate a gray area, escaping any regulatory oversight, and that's part of their ability. So I think the answer will come, as you probably imply, from some regulatory intervention. It's not I would imagine that sooner or later, when a firm has near monopoly in the search, some degree of ex ante regulation will be required, and perhaps data may come attached to it. There is also, though, a Google-specific problem of two kinds. Google has made it very opaque, has made they are present in so many different segments of the ad tech that and they always say it's so complicated, which makes the regulators very reluctant to intervene because they are being told it's so complex, which is part of the problem. And also the other problem, which has been my disappointment, despite Google being very close to the academic community, they actually never wanted to talk to us specifically. Once again, to the computer scientists, there is a revolving door system, and that's great. But to your community, they didn't want to engage, and they decided to take a more legalistic approach of being represented by their own counsels, by their own lawyers, and instead of having a thriving economic research group, they obviously went where the big money is, and they are. So it's paradoxical, as many of us know. Breen and Page, they knew exactly the problem of the business model, and they tried to have a search engine in the academic realm. That's what they called for in their own 1999 paper out of their PhD. So they know all the social problem that the business model represents, but then they went on to do something different. So they are exactly informed about what we're talking about, but then they went on to make a lot of money.
Indeed.
So anything more on the regulation topic? I mean,
no, how much time do we have? Because there is a
well, in
topic.
principle, we have
almost
4 more
done.
minutes, so we're almost done.
Can I raise one topic,
Of course,
which I
please.
don't think we have actually talked about? And we talked a lot about conduct and not enough about mergers. And this is an area where I think in the tech space, work needs to be done. Of course, again, a plea for that. We are all super familiar and very much in love with the work, of course, of Florian, well, I should say Colleen Cunningham et al. On in pharma, of course, all the killer acquisition seminar work. And every time we discuss this in the context of tech, there is a position that Florian and Colleen put forward. We don't have the same good data. We really can't sort of draw the same conclusion. We in the policy arena have agencies like the CMA, Mike perhaps is still online, which have been quite, I think, ambitious, and rightly so, in pursuing these kind of concerns, specifically in cases. So we are really very much into potential competition theories, killer acquisition, reverse killer acquisitions. But this is something which is still perceived outside as being, and I mean by companies and their advocates, as being incredibly adventurous, unfounded. It's something that we don't have any basis for. It is the agency playing, sort of looking at the crystal ball, gazing at the crystal ball. We are committing all these type 1 errors. So again, this is an area where more work should be done. Look at the past acquisition, come up with something, do something a bit more systematic about the famous hundreds of acquisitions that have been done. Can we draw any inferences from that? No, we've never looked at them because they never kind of made it, or very few of them made the grade for an analysis. But perhaps the data set can be assembled. This is another area where I think thinking more would be very helpful to agencies.
I also would second, I agree with everything Christina said. And also this is a place where the data obstacle is not quite the same. It's not about extracting data from Google or Amazon. This is about venture capital, about new firm formation. There could be creative places to get data, particularly in specific sub areas. And I think with some thinking and creativity and new data, real progress could be made.
Well, actually on that score, because it's digital, I would be looking at LinkedIn data. What happens to these people who are with one of these firms, and where do they go? Is that the killer acquisition isn't that they take all the people who are working for the company out and shoot them. They just let them go. So, we should be able to trace that.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, we're on time.
Okay.
Oops, you're muted.
You're muted.
I'm muted. There's not enough competition in this Zoom.
We cannot be in Rome, but
No one has solved the mute
Yeah.
problem. Why haven't we had the mute problem solved? It's been going on for that. It's affected hundreds of millions of people. And yet, just because there isn't an advertising business model for this, we haven't solved it.
Well said.
Yeah, I will close on that note. So let me thank very much the panelists. This was great. I very much appreciate you all coming. And let me say to the audience that we have been recording this and the video of the session will be posted to the website shortly. Thank you all. And
thank you, everybody.
there's
Thank
another BIOS
Thank you.
seminar next Wednesday.
Very good. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.